You know, just because something is easy to make doesn't mean it can't also be incredible. Look no further than the humble toaster strudel, a warm, moist, flaky pastry filled with a wide variety of flavorful fillings, and the only breakfast that includes a cum shot minigame. All of this for pennies on the dollar and fully prepared in minutes with minimal effort. Seriously, these things are so good when you don't have a bitch in your ear telling you they're nasty. To me, that's what Armored Core was, a toaster strudel. Something simple, easy, and satisfying to hold us over while Mommy FromSoft prepared the real meal that Shadow of the Erdtree was supposed to be. However, if you've seen my last video, then you know how I feel about the content in Shadow of the Erdtree. And you also probably heard me say some things about Armored Core that came off as entirely negative, which was not my intention, and is what inspired me to finally make a video talking about Armored Core, which will serve partially as an apology and partially as an explanation. See, in the past I've avoided talking about Armored Core with much detail for two main reasons. The first being that Armored Core is very much not my type of game. I don't really care for mech games or media all that much, and there's a variety of gameplay reasons which I'll detail later as to why I don't find this type of a game enjoyable. And the second reason is because I was completely content with what Armored Core was supposed to be from my perspective at the time, which was essentially a GoFundMe for Shadow of the Erdtree. And that's not to say that Armored Core isn't a fully functioning, fleshed out game of its own that works well enough as a mech game, but let's be clear about something. Mech games spawned from dead IPs that haven't seen the light of day in over a decade don't sell 3 million copies. When the first trailer dropped for Armored Core, it had been over a year since Elden Ring's release. And instead of DLC news, we got a reboot which was meant to be a love letter aimed at all the fans of the old Armored Core series. And I'm sure both of you were excited to see it. My boy iBootyJuice was excited as well, yet he eventually lost interest and never actually finished a game. I, for one, would say that my main emotion and reaction to the trailer was confusion. I wondered why FromSoft would follow the height of their success after finally breaking into the mainstream with such a niche, obscure title. And don't get me wrong, I like that From would pay homage to their roots and appease their longtime fans with a wholesome release. It's just the timing that really bothered me. All I wanted at the time was more reasons to play Elden Ring, more content to master, and more refined bosses that fully take advantage of the combat systems implemented in Elden Ring. Instead, we got something completely out of left field that only managed to interest a fraction of the fan base that FromSoft had developed in the wake of Elden Ring. A product that was celebrated for selling 3 million copies when From's previously released title sold 25 million. Is it fair to compare the two? Of course not, but it does highlight the strange timing that Armored Core's release date took place in. The only way I could rationalize this was to simply say, whatever, it's FromSoft. It'll fund the DLC of one of my favorite games ever, I'll buy it, and I won't be all that invested in its actual quality. However, this contrivance within my investment of a FromSoft game left me with another bit of discontent in relationship to my overall philosophy of FromSoft's design. I've explained this several times before within many other videos, but this philosophy was developed after I finally got the chance to tackle Bloodborne, a game with an aesthetic feel that I have a strong affinity for and had every reason in the world to glaze up, and yet, to be completely reductive, because I have a whole video essay discussing my feelings on the matter already, I found Bloodborne to be a very cool but mechanically simple game with deceptively slow combat and mostly garbage bosses. This placed Bloodborne just above DS2 and below DS3 on my tier list, unintentionally completing my list as reverse chronological. You see, despite what many dismissive comments might say in an effort to invalidate my opinions, I'm not fully a FromSoft dick rider, and I don't fully just hate everything. I mean, I do blow bubbles on From's dick and I do hate everything, but I'd like to think there's at least some amount of nuance there. Keep in mind, reverse chronological means that the fan favorite DS1 is at the very bottom of my list, my least favorite From title, excluding Demon's Souls because I've only played the remake, which was fun, but I would probably still put it lower than DS1. Anyway, I'd like to consider myself very realistic when it comes to analyzing FromSoft's work, and that means acknowledging that most of the difficult aspects of DS1's design were essentially due to incompetent, inexperienced design choices. Take, for example, your first trip to Anor Londo, which involves traversing the rafters of the painting chamber, a challenge that is only dangerous due to the manufactured difficulty of arbitrarily placing otherwise harmless enemies in the nonsensical position of guarding rafters. On top of that, the majority of your deaths here will mostly be attributed to the clunky mechanics of the movement systems, or dead painting guardians still having hitboxes for a few seconds after their defeat, which pushes you to your death as you attempt to move past them. Not far after that, you're tasked with another situation where the only real danger is being knocked to your death in another manufactured way. Silver Knights are very well designed enemies, yet placing them here reduces them to one-trick ponies designed to punish you for no other reason than Miyazaki liking when he dies in video games, I guess. And I fully recognize that DS1 is a very important historical game that changed the fate of the industry in a powerful way, birthing a new era of video games with rewarding difficulty. However, to say the quiet part out loud, DS1 is mostly difficult because it was designed in stupid, frustrating ways, and the main source of reward within its gameplay comes from subverting the stupid design and avoiding the frustration, otherwise known as getting good. With this as a base template and having been thrust into a success, FromSoft spent the subsequent decade building on the design of their big break, unintentionally creating the Souls genre in the process, and through this process became tremendously experienced, well-seasoned, and wildly creative game devs. And so my analysis of FromSoft leaves me with my theory of their design. And no, it's not the dying is fun thing. I believe that FromSoft games are always better than the last, because they as a company generally learn from their mistakes, they're bold enough to try new things, and they consistently refine their formula to a more rewarding and satisfying gameplay loop with stronger and more complex combat. At least I used to believe that. Armored Core was the first real hiccup I had seen in the ideas I had about FromSoft. Even when being generous, I wouldn't come close to saying that Armored Core is better than DS3, and having to make an exception when it came to AC left me with discontent no matter how I looked at it. The best way I could rationalize this game was to say, well, at least it's probably the best of the Armored Core series, and therefore still fits within the ideals of FromSoft elevating their work. It was simply a rationalization that relied on From having elevated work that had been left in the past a long time ago, essentially starting their Souls journey of refinement all over again but with a different IP. It certainly bothered me that I didn't have to make the same exception for Sekiro, a game that is also systemically different than Souls, yet feels unmatched in refinement at the cost of RPG elements, but I would argue easily earns its place above DS3 in my tier list. As well as that, Sekiro brought fresh ideas to the table, such as crouchable sprinting stealth, jumpable attacks, and deflections, ideas that Elden Ring would bring forward. Sekiro fits very nicely into my FromSoft theory of innovation and refinement, whereas Armored Core did not, which is why I found it easier to categorize it as a fundraising title more than a title of its own. Again, not because it doesn't stand on its own, but because it doesn't stand on its own as a post-Elden Ring FromSoft title. Armored Core borrows very little from the ideas that FromSoft had developed in the past, and essentially picks up where they left off over a decade ago. And that's likely the reason I claim that it feels like a Walmart demo from the 2010s. Keep in mind I say feels like rather than looks like. A bunch of people got upset at that comment, assuming that I meant the visuals were outdated, I guess. I only meant that the gameplay has a similar feel to the mech games you would frequently see on the Xbox 360, the weightless, floaty, limited physics gameplay of a 2010s mech video game. And the simple explanation as to why Armored Core feels that way is because it is that way. It's the continuation and imitation of a 2010 series of mech games. It's really kind of jarring to have seen FromSoft start with a clunky niche game like DS1, which was unfriendly towards casuals due to its poor design, resulting in a gatekeeper's wet dream, and then claw their way into mainstream relevancy by refining and innovating their games until they had dominated and humbled the industry with the release of Elden Ring, only to so casually trip at the finish line that was supposed to be a refined Elden Ring DLC, and begin sprinting in the wrong direction all the way back to 2012, the release of Armored Core 5. No matter how you look at it, you have to have an excuse as to why Armored Core was released in between the time that Elden Ring and its DLC was released. Whether you wish to be charitable with that excuse or not is up to you, but like it or not, there has to be an explanation. You could make the argument that AC had been on the back burner for years, having been worked on by a smaller, less important team during the development of Elden Ring, and just so happened to be finished around this time period. You could make the argument that Armored Core fans were swarming FromSoft's main offices, demanding a new game, and FromSoft was simply giving in to the mob. I, for one, believe that Armored Core was simply a fundraising title, and exists as a clever way to leverage the success of Elden Ring into short-term profits. The reason I believe this is because Armored Core, like a toaster strudel, was very easy for FromSoft to make. Now, there's a lot of points I've made throughout my YouTube video essay career that I could easily be swayed on. I often claim that DS2 looks like shit because it's easy to think back on enemy design like the Falconeers and the Mummy Turtle Pyromancers and to remember the game as ugly as fuck. But there's also the Shrine of Amana, which, when separated from the gameplay experience, is really quite nice to look at. I'm not above making compromises on many of my arguments, especially the ones I say in passing. However, one thing I can say with near certainty is that Armored Core was easy to make. And that sounds a little harsh, so I'll try using different phrasing, such as Armored Core was made efficiently, to soften the blow. But come on, you know what I mean. So let's talk about efficiency, starting with the hub area, the Firelink Shrine of Armored Core. Armored Core doesn't have one, instead opting for a menu system for all of the standard hub world upgrades and vendor functions. I can see the value in this system, in its efficiency, and I think other games in certain instances could take inspiration from a design choice like this. Diablo 4, for instance, especially in its current loot-focused form, will have you constantly returning to the hub area to scrap loot and enchant or upgrade items. And as grindy as that game can get in its endgame, I often found myself frustrated in locating and tediously walking around to the various points of interest in the hub areas. I would have greatly appreciated an option to enter a pause menu system that would allow me to quickly and efficiently access the hub world functions and return to the other aspects of the game in a timely manner. However, I would emphasize that this should only be implemented as a toggleable feature and only after you've gotten sick of the hub areas after playing the game once through. The mini hub towns of Diablo are distinctly valuable in developing a sense of immersion within a very simple game, and the world of Diablo would feel much more hollow without them. If Armored Core was attempting to be anything more than a simple, efficiently made game which does the bare minimum effort to meet the mark of a reboot or sequel, it would have implemented an immersive hub area with interactable characters and vendors with your AC towering above you, which would give some weight to the size and scale of an AC while standing next to one as a human-sized character. I do think that we can assume that the ACs as they currently exist lack the detail to sufficiently paint that picture and would probably look quite silly from that scale, which is what you would expect from such an efficiently made game. And so what we get instead is a simple menu system and a barrage of voice messages to fill the role of character development and storytelling every time you return to the hub, all made very efficiently. It's like oatmeal, or straight porn. It'll get the job done, but it's boring. Next, let's move on to the world area of the game, 90% of which will be simple skyboxes. Sure, they look cool enough, but the area of play is often quite small, cutting you off with these old-school, outdated, out-of-bounds borders arbitrarily blocking your path. Like what? Is there a school 50 yards from this point? Maybe next time we hijack an Armored Core license, we find one that isn't a registered sex offender? On top of the world areas being relatively small and also being implemented in a mission-style framing rather than an open world or interconnected world style which we've come to expect in modern times, the game also very efficiently reuses many of those areas for subsequent missions and especially reuses any of the boss arenas. This could be by slapping a new boss in the arena itself, or more frequently by utilizing the area for an arena battle. This is nothing new for FromSoft, who often reuses boss arenas across their games. However, I would say on a subjective level that I find most of their prior reuses to be much more justified in-world and less inspired by efficiency. The Ashenit Castle rooftop area is used in many fights in Sekiro, especially if you count the boss gauntlet fights, and this is very appropriate considering the significance of the location and the scenic value of shinobi and samurai clashing against one another in an arena that overlooks the rest of the world in a fight that will decide the fate of that world. The fights at the base of the Erd Tree in Elden Ring have obvious significance, being that the arena separates you from coming face to face with God, but also the fight with Hoarah Loux being placed in the same arena here has a strong storytelling purpose as well. demonstrated by Godfrey holding his son Morgoth's corpse before it fades into grace and points him towards the Tarnished. Both of these examples have distinct justifications for being reused content, and each fight placed within them strengthens the game overall. Whereas there was absolutely no restraint or thoughtful design when it came to reusing Armored Core content. I don't think there's a single fight within the game that implements a previously used area in a way that elevates the opponent or the area in any way, even going so far as to have the final 3 fights in the arena take place in an out-of-service holodeck rather than anything interesting or meaningful. The rest of the area recycling boils down to building another mission within the same area, which results in one mission or the other inevitably outshining and overshadowing the other. I would argue that there isn't a single moment throughout the entire game where reusing an area was utilized with any other purpose than quickly and efficiently printing out a finished game. I estimate generously that around 60% of the game is undeniably filler, and just about every revisit to an area could have been merged within the original visit, which would shave away the abundance of missions which only have you killing a handful of paper-thin one-shot robots. And that's not to mention that the game features multiple endings, some of which you'll only be able to see on your 3rd new game cycle. So rather than create a game rich in original creative content, players are encouraged to play the game 3 times over to get their full money's worth, which means playing through each early game mind-numbing kill a handful of one-shot robot missions 3 times each. But also each of the reused areas you'll have to see 6 times, and your reward for enduring all that is that you'll see an alternate storyline, which essentially simply means betraying characters you previously allied with and fighting with them in different locations than you've already fought them in. Because all of the characters besides the final boss fights with either Cortana or Handler Walter are already fights within the arena, and that's another reason that this game was made so efficiently. A huge portion of the main battles you have in this game are with Armored Core users, essentially the equivalent of a Souls invader, and this is a ridiculously massive source of reusable content to flesh the game out with. Each AC character in this game can be used for the plot, as a fight within the campaign, sometimes as a second fight within the campaign if their core wasn't destroyed, as a different fight in the alternate plotline, as an ally in certain missions, and as an arena fight. Each of their ACs can be unlocked and utilized by the player using the exact same stats and functions, including their weapons. They really are just invader fights, serving as a cookie-cutter way to reuse the weapon and armor assets given to the player and flesh out the game with challenges. Unfortunately, there's a reason that most Souls games aren't comprised of 90% invader fights, even if that would be an easy way to fill out a game with enemies. Invader fights get really boring, and there's only so many things that can be done with the framework of a player model with some AI. All this really provides is a PvP simulation, which is a weird choice to center the campaign around when the game also features a PvP mode. And it's especially misguided when you realize how unbalanced the game is and how most of these fights can be absolutely destroyed instantly using the same basic strategies for all of them. To me, the pinnacle of this concept falling flat on its face is when we're confronted by the original Raven, whom we stole the call sign from at the beginning of the game. This should be a very powerful and cinematic boss fight. However, once the combat begins, you're presented with the same 2 mechs dashing around style of combat that almost every single fight is. The bottom line is, no matter what the game, taking the character model, giving it a specific build, and then adding simple AI makes for very simple, boring, cheaply made filler fights. And sometimes that's justified when used sparingly in excess optional content. But when filler is the majority of the content in your game, with the C-weapon boss fights being the rare exception, then you have no choice but to admit that your game was made cheaply and easily. I don't know how anyone could look at this content and think otherwise. And that certainly isn't an issue when it comes down to the quality of the game. I mean, it's a mech game. If you're into that type of thing, it might be your favorite FromSoft game. The problem where I see it comes down to the price tag. Minecraft is another game that was easy to make, which is why its price generally sits around $20, depending on the console and edition. Even despite being a beloved game that most people spend more time playing than a AAA $60 to $70 game, its price reflects the effort required to create it. With that in mind, I wouldn't feel comfortable paying more than $30 for Armored Core in this day and age with this amount of reused content. It would be one thing if the filler and the small world size and the lack of hub world were the cost to develop many incredible, memorable boss fights. But as it stands, the filler is the game. and there's only like 6 total boss fights otherwise, one of which is the completely underwhelming Yorm style fight, which implements a single weapon you're forced to use, which simplifies the fight and undercuts the spectacle of it all. Turning the mission into an extremely drawn out and boring boss fight you'll have to do 3 times to see the true ending of the game. And like I said earlier, I didn't mind paying full price at all for Armored Core at the time of its release, because I was making that purchase under the assumption that the money would be going towards the dev team working their asses off to make Shadow of the Erdtree. In hindsight, however, I now believe that the excess money generated by Elden Ring and Armored Core was spent hiring new members to FromSoft's team, rather than give the experienced members the time and resources necessary to create a complete Elden Ring sequel, which I now believe was the original intent behind Shadow of the Erdtree. I've spent the last 2 months trying to understand why this expansion feels so much like an aborted fetus, despite being the most impressively grandiose DLC ever released. And I think the most simple explanation is to realize that it really is just an aborted fetus of what was meant to be a sequel. The entire philosophy behind its design is the opposite of what you would expect from a DLC. Massive empty areas to explore with your fully leveled character who has almost nothing to gain by exploring. The standard sloppy early game boss fights, except they're only early game in the DLC, having massive health bars which fully showcase the sloppy nature of their design. Massive innovations to the weapon and combat system that change the game's meta drastically. And boss fights that can be entirely summarized by describing them as over-designed and under-refined. I'm fully convinced until proven otherwise that this content was a developing sequel that was brutally and hastily ripped from its womb with several insufficient bandages placed on the hemorrhaging wounds. Those bandages being the deflection physic, backstep iframes, and the many incredibly broken weapons and spells. Which is FromSoft essentially saying, we don't have to make the game good if we give players enough overpowered shit to fill the holes in our shoddy design. Get good, you dumbass bitches. And so, to bring it back to Armored Core, if I had paid full price for an easily made game and the Elden Ring DLC was good, I wouldn't have had any problem with that. It makes sense to fundraise with an older title, giving fans of that title some love in a simple, easy way that doesn't take any risks, and use that money to supplement larger projects. However, FromSoft seems to have aborted their largest project, committed to smaller scale projects, and then hired a bunch of new staff members to work on multiple projects at once. Which to me just sounds like FromSoft committing to lowering their standards of quality they've developed over the last decade. It sounds like they've diluted their workforce, spreading the experienced members out across many projects, and then supplemented the labor with fresh hires. And that's the thing that's really worrying me about the events that have unfolded post Elden Ring. We got Armored Core, a game that takes a massive leap back in time to 2012, then sells us a cheaply made mech game for full price, and then Shadow of the Erdtree, which is filled with content that's difficulty is, once again like in 2011, based on incompetent design. If there's no developer-intended method to dodge a move, then a boss's design is based on ignorance and is nothing worth celebrating. And to all you dumbasses who think that Radahn is the hardest boss in gaming history, well, you're wrong. Seath's first encounter would be. What's your argument against that? There's no developer-intended way to beat him? Well, I couldn't agree more. So our options are to either raise our standards, which disqualifies PC Radahn, or to accept that an unbeatable dragon that should have been a cutscene is the hardest boss ever. I'll leave you to decide. I am currently in a very disgruntled mindset when it comes to FromSoft, especially when Lies of P came out of nowhere during a time period with no From content and blew us away with its unique, innovative design, building on aspects of From's formula in never-before-seen ways. It certainly doesn't inspire hope when Miyazaki is quoted as saying that Elden Ring is the limit, and that they're focusing on small projects. It doesn't really sound like words you would want to hear from the company responsible for creating Dark Souls, the poster child for the phrase get good. That being said, I'm still clinging on to a bit of hope that all of this is the cost for their next great project, whatever it might be. I'll probably give it like 2 more shitty From releases before I give up on them. Now, everything I've mentioned about Armored Core so far could all be forgiven if the game was $30. I think it stands on its own without the FromSoft name as a $30 mech game. But it's not just a mech game. It's a FromSoft mech game, and with that comes a certain expectation as far as difficulty is concerned. On launch day, me and a bunch of other fresh-faced AC pilots took to the game with that expectation in mind, with many of us getting stuck on the first boss with the helicopter. The expectation would be that we would bash our heads against the first boss for a while until memorizing a few of its attack patterns and then muscling through. However, I didn't make progress in this fight for a good portion of time until I realized that my mech came equipped with a laser sword. And then the true nature of the boss fight, which I would later realize applies to the whole game, was revealed to me. Armored Core is not a game where you memorize boss patterns. They're mostly irrelevant except for large missile hits, all audibly telegraphed with the same warning. In fact, attempting to learn the boss patterns and play patiently like you would in a Souls game will largely be Armored Core's equivalent to a noob trap. This lesson was reinforced to me when I attempted to beat the second skill check boss with a horribly optimized build because I figured I would beat the boss with skill rather than overpowered equipment. Learning this boss eventually proved to be utterly useless in actually defeating the boss, especially after I realized that my weapon didn't have the ammo capacity to actually take him down. It's at this point that you'll probably either stop playing the game because you'll realize that it's not a Souls game, or you'll realize the true nature of Armored Core, which is that there's no real skill involved in the gameplay of Armored Core. And no, I'm not being edgy and insulting, I already did that with the Radahn bit. The skill of Armored Core comes in the mech design menu almost exclusively, and there is absolutely a right and wrong way to play this game. I hate to be the one to say this because I really don't want to be the guy who says you're playing the game wrong to anyone, but it is an undeniable aspect of Armored Core. I would argue that most games and encounters exist on some kind of a spectrum of playing the game wrong, but ideally it would be efficiently telegraphed to the player. Using a fire spell on an enemy immune to fire in Baldur's Gate is pretty far on the playing the game wrong side of the spectrum, because no matter how hard you try, that strategy will never work. In the same way, my first strategy against the missile boss in Armored Core would also never work no matter how good I got and no matter how many attempts I made. And while there are many builds that would work eventually against many bosses in Armored Core, there's also a statistically best build to use on them. The real fundamental skill set of Armored Core is to equip that build and then crush the game with little mind given to whatever the enemies are attempting to do to you. And I'm by no means an expert at Armored Core, but the best build I came up with was to obviously equip both of the needle launcher shoulder weapons, which are miles above anything else in the shoulder category, then the melee weapon which sends you flying towards the enemy, and the now nerfed heavy shotgun. With this build, I beat the rest of the game up to the final boss and the entire arena without dying once, and I haven't played this game in over a year. The biggest problem I find with this is that it makes a large portion of the weapons and armors almost entirely irrelevant, and also heavily favors the meta of the game into heavier AC builds. The main choice you'll have in builds within Armored Core is to either make a fast light mech or a heavy slow mech, which largely revolves around your choice in leg components. And that sounds like a pretty standard trade-off in a video game, right? Maneuverability or survivability. Well, that would be the case if it weren't for two factors. Firstly, maneuverability is mostly meaningless within a game with no iframes and a bullet hell or missile hell style of gameplay. And secondly, your weapon damage is also tied to a weight class, which is really the nail in the coffin of lightweight builds. High damage weapons means you'll spend less time in the boss fight, which means your survivability attribute becomes exponentially more valuable within that build. Building on that, high damage weapons tend to build up the overheat bar more quickly and more efficiently in large bursts, likely to trigger the effect more consistently, which not only gives you more openings to deal direct damage to the enemy, but also gives the enemy less total time to attack you within a fight. Again, this reinforces the viability of a survivability build. And on that note of the overheat mechanic, I don't really see what this mechanic is supposed to add to the gameplay experience. There's really no tactical advantage you can use to optimize your damage in overheat instances. By the time you've triggered the overheat, you've likely spammed every one of your abilities the second their cooldown was up, leaving you to spend the overheat time also spamming your weapon the second their cooldowns are up. And that's kind of the whole experience of Armored Core. There's very little you're able to use tactically to hedge your bets in any fight, once again leaving the majority of the skill set of the game within the menus. And even in the menus, your options become to either build a heavy mech with high health, high damage, which will finish fights quickly and simply, most of the time overheating and overpowering the bosses or ACs for large portions of the fight, or you can make a fast mech. And at this point it just feels like I'm piling on and attempting to make people not like the game, which was not my intention. Again, I just feel like it's important to be realistic about FromSoft games. They're not always great. I think that's worth acknowledging even if there's aspects of the game that are truly great. I strongly believe that it's worth isolating the great aspects of their design and building off of them, which From has done an excellent job of doing for a long time. But that means being truly harsh when it's time to cut away the fat and realize that this is a very basic mech game. It would have been excellent if designed in 2012, but the year is at least 2023, I think, and this is FromSoft we're talking about. I expect better than mindless mech games and aborted fetus DLCs. I think it's long past time that the games industry realizes that hiring and firing people are decisions made with business and profit in mind, not creativity. Take for instance my favorite game ever, Lords of the Fallen, the developers of which fired 10% of their staff, then shortly after fired another 30 members, shortly before announcing the sequel to Lords of the Fallen. Yeah, I'm sure the fucking copy and paste game will be much better with half the staff involved. Sounds like a recipe for success to me. It goes without saying, but Bungie is also basically dead in the water, firing like 200 more people after what everyone assumed would be their final expansion to Destiny. And now they're entirely relying on the success of Marathon to keep the company afloat. I can only hope that after a period of adjustment, the new hires at FromSoft will learn well from their more experienced team members, and will continue to see the industry prosper. It would be a real shame if From decided to throw fresh hires at simple, easy-to-make projects from now on. Right?